Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Repro Action's Act and Learn webinar for the month of May 2023. We're incredibly excited and resolved about today's topic, which is Repro Justice 202, DC Statehood and you. Answer to the question is, what does DC's lack of statehood have to do with barriers to achieving reproductive justice for every person? Answer is quite a lot. So we'll dive into that more today. First, we'll introduce your host. First voice you're hearing is Erin Matson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm co-founder and executive director of Repro Action. I'm based in DC, and I'm Erin to the Max on Twitter.
And I'm the second voice you'll be hearing. My name is Layla Salam. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the organizer for Repro Action, and I'm also based in Washington, D.C.
Awesome. So I'll give a brief overview of our agenda. We'll introduce Repro Action and our organization. Then we'll do a topic overview and introduction. We'll go into our panel discussion. We are so excited to be joined by two fabulous panelists today. First, we'll have Jade Hurley from DC Abortion Fund, and then we'll be joined by Bree McGowan of Women Who Code DC, as well as Delicious Democracy. Then we'll go into next steps, and finally, we'll conclude with Q&A. So a note about that, if you have questions at any point, whether it's questions about Layla's upcoming presentation or questions for Jade or Bree or any question whatsoever, just put them into the questions tab whenever you have them. You don't have to wait until the end, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. Also, if you are still on Twitter, in spite of Elon Musk, feel free to join us there. Please use the hashtag ReproAction to follow along there. And with that, I'll introduce our organization. So Repro Action leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are fiercely proud of our left flank analysis and our fearless willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable to increasing access to abortion and advancing reproductive justice, whether they are allies or opposition. So anyone who stands in the way, we are fearless on our willingness to hold them accountable. We have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. And if it is not abundantly clear, I would like to make it clear that we demand statehood for the residents of DC and equality. So with that, I will pass it over to my esteemed colleague, Layla Salam.
Thank you so much, Erin. So I think it's really important to provide a lot of background when going into this issue. As Erin previously mentioned, Washington, D.C. is not a state. In fact, it was established by Congress in 1790 to create a permanent seat for the U.S. government that was separate from any other state government. So because of Washington, D.C.'s status as a non-state, it has a very different political process than other states. So other states have the ability to vote on the federal laws that govern them, while D.C. does not. As you may know, D.C. has one representative in Congress, which is one member in the House of Representatives. That member is able to draft bills, voice their support for different bills and legislation, but has no voting power, even on laws that they themselves may introduce. In addition to this, Congress has ultimate control over DC's local laws and budget, meaning any laws that are passed within the DC City Council and by locally elected representatives must then be approved by Congress to actually become law. And Congress does also maintain the ability to abolish local DC laws and government if they so choose. In addition, it is very important to emphasize that DC is the only capital of a democracy in the world with no voting representation in the national legislature. So with that background, it's important to get into how this relates to the reproductive justice and reproductive landscape in Washington, D.C. I want to make sure that this conversation that we have going forward about DC and DC statehood is really grounded in the principles of reproductive justice and intersectionality. DC has gained the nickname of Chocolate City for its very large African American population, which only in the past 20 years has dipped below 50% of the population being African American. So these reproductive justice issues and racial justice issues are very closely tied in the city of Washington, D.C., and we cannot discuss reproductive rights here or anywhere without discussing anti-Blackness and Black liberation. This is particularly important as we look at the population breakdown of Washington, D.C. In 2022, 43.46% of DC's population was African American. At the same time, the African American population had the second lowest average household income, which is represented on the graph below. This is particularly important when it comes to reproductive justice and particularly access to abortion care, because according to the Guttmacher Institute, about 75% of people who have abortions are low-income people, with 60% of those people being people of color. So it's very important to examine how the Black populations in DC are particularly affected and disproportionately affected by the reproductive rights restrictions in the city, which I will continue to speak about. Some of the main barriers to reproductive care in Washington, D.C. include gentrification, maternal mortality, and childcare costs. Gentrification in D.C. is a particularly large issue, as D.C. has experienced the most intense gentrification of any city in the country between the years 2000 and 2013. This experience of gentrification has led to an extreme rise in home costs and cultural displacement of Native Black populations in the Washington, D.C. area. A lot of this gentrification of the city can be represented through the ward system that the city has. DC has a total of 8 wards, with wards 7 and 8 being located east of the Anacostia River. Wards 7 and 8 have a majority Black population and are also the most economically disadvantaged wards in the city. This is particularly important because residents of wards 7 and 8 comprised 70% of pregnancy-related deaths, while residents of wards 2 and 3, which are predominantly white and wealthy, reported no pregnancy-associated deaths in the same reporting period from 2014 to 2018. This brings us to the issue of maternal mortality in DC. A shocking statistic is that Black birthing people in Washington, D.C. make up 90% of pregnancy-related deaths, despite comprising only 30% of all births in the city. It was statistics like this that called different people in DC to call upon the local government to establish some sort of research committee to review these staggering statistics. So in 2018, DC established a maternal mortality review committee that created a process to research and analyze data on maternal mortality in order to understand why it was such a pervasive issue in DC. What this council found is that DC's maternal mortality rate is 23.1 deaths per 100,000 live births. While this number is not statistically significantly different from the national maternal mortality rate, it is very different in one aspect: the fact that African American Black birthing people make up such a large percentage of those pregnancy-related deaths. Also, when discussing reproductive justice in DC, it's important to address the childcare costs in the city, which also are a huge barrier for people raising their children in safe and healthy communities and in the way they would like to. DC has the most expensive childcare system in the country, and this is particularly because it's very difficult for the local DC government to subsidize the childcare system because their budget is directly approved by Congress. So the childcare system in DC is never fully funded to meet the needs of parents in DC. There are a few initiatives that are working to subsidize this cost, one of those being the Birth to 3 Act, which is looking to subsidize the cost of childcare so no family pays more than 10% of their income on childcare costs. But while initiatives like this are so helpful, it's often difficult because of what was previously mentioned. This all depends on if this legislation can be passed, if it can be approved, it can be fully funded, and then approved by Congress. And the final aspect of DC statehood and reproductive rights care and abortion care that I will mention is the Dornan Amendment. So the Dornan Amendment is an amendment that was introduced in 1989, and it prevents DC from using Medicaid dollars to pay for abortion care. If you recall the statistic I brought up earlier from the Guttmacher Institute that states that 75% of people who have abortions are low income, you'd see why this is a huge issue. for abortion care in DC, because people are not able to use their medical dollars to pay for abortion care if they would want to. This often means people have to delay abortion care in order to finance it. They have to make difficult financial decisions like borrowing money, taking out loans, or making the choice between paying for their abortion and paying for their bills. We know the detrimental effect that the Dornan Amendment has because there was a brief period during the Obama administration without the Dornan Amendment from 2009 to 2011. But since then, it has been reinstated and consistently used as a bargaining chip by anti-abortion lawmakers to stop people from using their own healthcare to finance abortion. It is also particularly important to conclude that initiatives like Dornan diminish the political and social power of the Black community in DC and disproportionately affect Black and low-income communities. So I'm so excited to be joined by Jade to talk a little bit more about the funding of abortion care and all of her amazing expertise. Jade is a Gen Z digital organizer, currently serving as the first ever communications manager at the DC Abortion Fund. Since 1995, DCAF has fought system barriers to reproductive rights by funding the abortion care of anyone living in or traveling to the DC metro region. DCAF is proud to be a vital resource and mobilizing force for the local and national movements for abortion access. Thank you so much for joining us, Jade.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you for that amazing introduction to a few of the reproductive injustices we see in DC. I think that if we wanted to go over all of them, it would take 10 hours. So thank you so much for, I feel like, prepping what I'm about to say so well.
Of course, thank you so much for joining us. So I wanted to start by asking you about why do you believe DC is such an important point of access for abortion care in this country?
Sure. So DC has been an abortion destination since 1971. So that's 2 years before Roe v. Wade was originally passed. And DC is this abortion haven destination and has been for so long because honestly, abortion is more accessible here than it is in most places in the country. So first of all, abortion is legal in Washington, DC at every stage in pregnancy. In DC, you can get an abortion at any age without the permission from a parent or guardian. That's huge for youth access. DC is home to 3 of the 4 clinics in the entire country at which you can receive an abortion in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So yes, that is true. 3 of these 4 clinics are in the DMV, and with the exception of our friends in Boulder, Colorado, the DMV area is literally patients' only shot to get an abortion later in pregnancy. Also, the DC region is home to multiple clinics. The DC Abortion Fund works with around 10 who perform abortion care, and 3 of those perform abortion care later in pregnancy too. And also, it kind of goes without saying, DC is a really progressive community. I feel like that was really exemplified through so much community support for us as the local abortion fund, especially last summer after Dobbs came down. So there are a lot of reasons why DC is this abortion destination. But yeah, despite our excellent care landscape here in the DMV, our lack of statehood, like you mentioned, definitely threatens DC's access as a safe haven.
Completely. And you mentioned about how the landscape has changed a bit since the Dobbs decision. And something else I wanted to ask you about is, what does DCAF see as the biggest barriers to DC providing abortion care to as many people as possible? As we just mentioned, all of the great things that DC has to offer, what do you see in your work as some of those barriers?
Definitely. So just to start, I want to say that DC, there are ways in which we're special in our inaccessibility of abortion care, but there's ways in which we're not, right? Like from DC to South Carolina to California, abortion care itself is inaccessible to working people because of its price, especially when we get to the 2nd and 3rd trimesters of pregnancy. So in DC, the cost of abortion ranges, depending on your gestational age, from $500, that's the lowest, to up to $25,000 just for your abortion care. So starting off, not a lot of people even have $500 to spare. here in DC right now. And then when you get to $25,000, that's sort of out of the question. And, you know, we believe that no one should have to pay for healthcare, including abortion care. But under our current healthcare system, where people are usually using insurance money to pay for their care, we would hope that that would be covered, considering this is such an expensive procedure and it's so vital to reproductive autonomy and the destiny and journeys of our lives. But there are several things that keep folks from using their insurance dollars or from being able to afford it at all. First of all, like you mentioned, there are DC specific budget restrictions. The Dornan Amendment, so DC Medicaid recipients are specifically barred from access, which keeps us from doing really cool progressive policy like what's being worked on in California, where you could use state funds for abortion care. So we can't do that because of the Dornan Amendment. Also, federal budget restrictions like the Hyde Amendment, as Layla mentioned, also are a huge hit to abortion seekers. So as mentioned, the Hyde Amendment means that zero federal funds can be put toward abortion care at any stage in pregnancy, and that includes federal employees, Indian Health Services beneficiaries, TRICARE beneficiaries, CHIP beneficiaries, RPCV, Peace Corps workers, and I could really go on. And being that we're our nation's capital, DC has a huge amount of federal employees. DC has a huge amount of folks who are hurt by the Hyde Amendment. So they're really, those budget restrictions really make sure that we have to fund a huge amount of procedures, and that the out-of-pocket costs for folks are so high that it means they have to either delay care or, worst of all, forego care unless they come to an abortion fund like us. And, you know, really, we believe that everyone should have access to care by their community, for their community, and in their community. And, you know, there's also practical support angles to it, where there are certain areas of DC where it's a little harder to get to an abortion clinic. Say if you live in Noma and the Planned Parenthood is right there, that's going to be a super easy walk or drive or metro. But if you live more far out, then you're also going to have to figure out how you get to your appointment, how you drive to your appointment, who's going to take care of your kids during your appointment. So that also can take dollars out of people's pockets to get their abortion care.
And I think you led right into this really well, but how do you feel that DCAF as an organization is able to fill a lot of the gaps that are left by the lack of funding of reproductive health care in both the DC budget and the federal budget?
So I think one of our main kind of driving forces and North Stars is that we really do think that even when systems fail us, we can take care of us through the power of mutual aid and community care. And like I said, we live in a city that's very, very supportive of abortion access and of reproductive justice. And yes, despite living in that very supportive city, like we said, Congress still has the final say on our budget and on our laws, which prevents DC from doing proactive legislation. But despite that, I mean, we're almost at this year, I think. So in 2023, we've almost hit the $1 million mark of funds pledged to abortion seekers. We've worked with over 1,000 patients just this year. And we've been able to do that through the power of mutual aid. We're not funded by big philanthropy. We're funded by neighbors giving small dollar donations to ensure that their community can get the abortion care that they want and need without having to think about the cost. And, you know, I believe that community care is how we fight capitalism and the reproductive injustices our systems force us to face. And I think it's really powerful that so many people in the community are sustaining donors to DCAF, who show up to our events, who are very loud and proud about being pro-abortion, and knowing that, you know, we want to keep DC as an abortion destination. We want to help not only people in our community, but people around the country to come here and be able to use all of our incredible abortion access resources, because not everywhere has 10 clinics. Not everywhere has one of the biggest abortion funds in the United States, which is us. So I think that we're able to fill those gaps through our community funding abortion and also funding our local practical support organizations, and really feeding into that mutual aid spirit.
Yeah, that's so amazing. Thank you guys so much for all of your incredible work. I think that just made me think a little bit about speaking about how it's not only DC residents who really benefit from all of the different services that DCAF has to offer. And I think on that note, it just came up to me to ask about how DCAF and how you have felt your work has changed since the Dobbs decision, and since a lot more people, particularly from the South, considering DC is such a close access point to the South, have been traveling here for their abortion care. And how do you see that affecting your work?
Definitely. So I get this question all the time, and I always answer in the same way of being like, it both hasn't changed anything and it's changed everything. Like, we've been around since 1995. We've been funding abortion since then. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel or anything. We just kept doing what we're doing. But we really have begun funding abortion on a much more massive scale. First of all, because I think Dobbs and the way that that played out in the public eye and in the news really introduced a lot of people for the first time to abortion funds. And I think that a lot of that was on the back of the growth in knowledge around mutual aid since the summer of 2020. So I think that, to give, a positive first, even though there's not many positives in this situation, I think a lot more people have been able to access these resources that have always been here and have become donors or supporters or community members of their local abortion funds, since there are over 100 in the country, and we're part of this beautiful connected infrastructure. But it definitely has increased our call volume. It has increased the amount we pledge. We used to pledge, our average pledge to a caller used to be in the 200s. It's now in the 600s. So that is a humongous jump, which shows us that abortion costs in the Washington, D.C. area are rising. Now, that doesn't necessarily, they're rising for our callers. Their cost out of pocket is rising. That doesn't mean that the actual price tag for abortion care in DC is rising. It means that more people are traveling here to get their care because they have no other place to go. And we most often see folks coming from the South in their second or their third trimester of pregnancy. And a lot of times that's because they've had to wait and delay their care long enough to get enough money to travel. That doesn't even mean they have enough money to pay for their actual abortion care procedure, which is where we come in. But they have to save enough to get a train ticket or plane ticket or gas money for their car or childcare for their kid or a hotel. There's just so many factors. And so we're seeing a huge amount of people coming from, honestly, all over the country. We had a person come from California very recently, which is honestly, it's shocking because that's so far away. But so a lot of people are coming from the South, a lot of people are coming from the Midwest, and they're spending every single dollar they can just getting here. So their funding gap is even larger. So we have been funding just on a much huger scale than we ever have before. We're dealing with funding gaps that we didn't even know existed. And I think overall, we don't even know the true need that's out there from DC to across the country. So really our mission is getting ourselves out there as much as possible, getting as many people as possible to know about abortion funds, to know they can access this resource, and that they can, chip into this community and protect themselves and others.
Yeah, I think you started to answer this a bit, but I was wondering, what are some more common reasons? You mentioned like the funding gaps have become, honestly, like things you've never seen before, but what are some of the common reasons that abortion seekers in DC or people who are seeking to have abortion care in DC typically need additional funding?
I think that they need additional funding usually because of all of the barriers to access we mentioned, like Dornan, Hyde, and more of these budget restrictions. But I think the main reason they need funding is because it's just too damn expensive. I think that, we're in a city right now where we don't have the full ability to control DC's budget or laws because it's under the purview of Congress, where, there are these conservative extremist members from faraway states who meddle in community affairs. I mean, if you see what's happening with the police reform bill in DC right now, that's just an example of a way that we can't make the proactive changes that we want that reflects what's going on in our city, which I think, these people in DC are struggling. It's extremely high cost of living. There's rising inflation. There's mass layoffs. We're coming out of I will say we're coming out of a pandemic, but really, like, COVID is here to stay. That's going to be a threat for the rest of our lives. And a lot of people are coming out of this with long-term health issues. There's a lot to pay for right now. And I think people in DC need to pay rent. They need to pay their bills. They need to have enough to save. They need to pay for their kids. They need to, sue them if they want to or something. Like, they want to experience joy and thrive and take care of themselves. And, shelling out between $500 and $25,000 isn't really going to cut it in these current economic conditions of the city. So I think it's just the whole system is really, really screwing our callers over, both from DC and from around the country.
Thank you so much for summing that up so well. I think to end on a positive note, something that you mentioned earlier that I want to circle back to, what would you say is your ideal for progressive abortion care or proactive legislation that DC could implement if it were to be a state? Just any positive vision you have.
Wow. I love this question. I feel like because I'm an access girl and not a policy girl, for me, and I would say this is something that I've really picked up from DCAF and DCAF's spirit and the way we've operated for almost the last 30 years, is through community care. I mean, my vision for a reproductive justice DC is one where no one has to pay for abortion care. In fact, no one has to pay for health care. It's one where organizations like DCAF and all of our local mutual aid organizations, which I definitely would check out if you haven't yet, there's one in every single ward in DC, is where all of us have really sustainable funding from our community, where everyone knows how important mutual aid is, and where we have the power to truly help every single caller that comes our way and to support each other as a mutual aid network in DC and then the National Abortion Fund Network. Honestly, my vision and my dream is that no one in the country is ever turned away from an abortion fund and are always able to secure funding, and that DCAF is a huge part of that. We do a lot of solidarity funding around the country, and so I would just love if no one was turned away. But in the long term, I would love to see our systems shift enough to where people don't have to pay for healthcare. We don't have to rely on the state for these things that are very intrinsic to us. I think, abortion care is autonomy and freedom and family and love. And I just don't think that the state should be involved in it to the point that it is. So yeah, just see a beautiful world of community care and abortion access for all.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Jade, for all of your insights. Always so incredible. Thank you so much for being here with us. And I'll pass it on to Erin.
Thanks, Layla.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you, Jade. That was awesome. So next up, I am delighted to introduce our second panelist, Bree McGowan. Bree uses she, her pronouns and is co-director for both Women Who Code DC and Delicious Democracy, DC's creative advocacy lab. She's a Python developer, poet, data scientist, modern dancer, TEDx speaker, and an advocate for transforming systems of power. Her mission is to develop AI and automation tools that are accessible, secure, and grounded in equity and community power. She is passionate about intersecting worlds, developing community-owned AI, and building a future DC state rooted in equitism, a joyful practice, and culture for building the next system. Bree leads through curiosity and empathy. She inspires her community to boldly envision what they desire and need to build a livable future for all of us, a future that defies the status quo and rigid binaries and fosters joy, community, and care. Bree, thank you so much for joining us today. Oh, Bree, do you need help to unmute? Let's see here. Let's try this. Bree, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey. I was trying to unmute but couldn't. Hello, thank you.
Yes, thrilled to have you here. So let's dive right into it. How would statehood give DC residents more control over their healthcare?
Right. I think Jade said it really well earlier, that with DC statehood, we would have the ability to spend federal funds however we wish, just like any other state. The fact that we're not able to spend federal healthcare on abortions was a deal that was struck with Republicans. And so it would mean that we would no longer be part of some political football amongst Republicans and Democrats, and that we would actually be able to use the federal healthcare how we wish to spend it, just like any other state. I also, when I hear DC statehood and DC autonomy with our healthcare, I also think of like autonomy over our courts. We would be able to have our own court system. Our own courts can determine rules, and lack of that statehood also means lack of that self-governance, which directly translates into how we're able to prosecute, how we're able to determine our court systems and things like that. And that directly also ties into healthcare, who has access, you know, what does even quote unquote punishment look like? It's all tied up into it. And I think that taking a step back, DC autonomy also means furthering self-autonomy for people in DC, especially Black and Brown people in DC. There was a DCist article that came out, I think a couple years ago, and it said that despite making up about half of all births in recent years, Black birthing people in DC made up about 90% of birth-related deaths, according to a new study from the MMRC, which is the Maternal Mortality Review Committee. And they reviewed pregnancy-associated deaths in DC between 2014 and 2018. And it was overwhelmingly also women, Black women from wards 5, 7, and 8. So this to me means that there needs to be legislative action to protect Black birthing people in DC, and why legislation is so tied up with something like DC autonomy is our legislative process. But there has been legislation that has been passed. So one example is Ward 6 Councilmember Charles Allen actually called for the city to seriously investigate the district's maternal mortality crisis, because for years DC has a maternal mortality rate that's well above the national average. And I believe it's the United Health Foundation that stated the statistic that in 2018, about 36 out of 100,000 live births compared to the national rate of 20.7. And the gap widens further for Black birthing people, where it was 42.7 per 100,000 live births, which means that for Black birthing people, the rate is 70.9. And that just to me means that not only is it the Black maternal mortality rate extremely high in DC, it also means that there are concentrated areas in DC where it is starkly felt. So Councilmember from Ward 1, Brianne Nadeau, also introduced to the council the Human Rights Sanctuary Amendment Act of 2022, which actually just was enacted and became law February of this year. And it protects the rights of those seeking care for abortion, contraception, sexual conduct, intimate relationships, and gender affirmation. And while this, is towards the movement for comprehensive healthcare, Brianna Nadeau said, we don't know what's on the horizon, but we will be ready. So this was a proactive legislation for the continuing, and as we are starting to experience in DC, some of our autonomy and people who are in Congress seeking to even overturn DC's home rule and ability to govern ourselves. And so our legislative process, even for our own healthcare, is directly tied with DC statehood, lack of statehood, the fight for statehood, and also Congress making DC a political football where even our healthcare could be a bargaining chip, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is so disturbing and disheartening. Can you walk us through the process of how a bill or ballot initiative in DC becomes law? Because as you've noted, the way other places in the US work is different than DC. DC seems to have its own set of rules because of the lack of statehood issue. So how does a bill or ballot initiative become law in DC? How is it different from the process in states? And what control does Congress really have over policies in DC?
Right. So DC has a unique process. One, because our council effectively acts as a state legislature, a unicameral state legislature. And because of lack of statehood, our bills also go through a congressional approval. No other state has to have their own elected officials who then sign something into law, have to also receive permission or passive approval from Congress and the president. So I'll go through the process of a bill becoming a law, and then I'll go through the process of a ballot initiative, which is essentially people putting something onto the ballot to pass a law rather than going through the council. So a bill, and this is ideally there are stakeholders that are involved. The council member has community input, significant community input when drafting, creating a bill with their legislative assistance. And then when the council member chooses to introduce a bill, they will do so, virtually. There was, I guess, the virtual Zoom dais, but I guess now that they're back in person, they will present it at the dais. And then the chairperson, who is currently Chairman Phil Mendelson, will determine which committee to send that bill to. There are, I believe, 11 committees that a bill could go to. And each committee has 5 council members. And so let's just take, for instance, health. There's actually 2 committees that are health related now. There's the Committee on Health and the Committee on Hospital and Health Equity. So I'll just use the Committee on Health, for example, and at-large council member Christina Henderson is the chair of that committee. So say there's a bill that is on something of the subject matter relating to healthcare. It'll go to council member Christina Henderson's Committee on Health, and then there will be a hearing, usually, where people from the community, stakeholders, experts can weigh in on the subject matter of a bill. And then after that hearing, the committee can honestly change and amend the bill how they see fit. Then there's a vote. The bill will make it out of committee if a majority of the council members in that committee vote yes. So you need at least 3 out of the 5 to vote yes. If the bill makes it past that point, it goes to the committee of the whole. Chairman Phil Mendelson will determine the agenda or when that bill will be set to be heard for the committee of the whole. There are two readings on it, and then the committee of the whole will then take a vote for all 13 council members. Now, if it passes, so I believe you need at least 7 or 8 to pass a bill, and then it goes on to the mayor. The mayor has the ability to review the bill. If the mayor chooses to veto a bill, it goes back to the council. The council then needs a 2/3 vote to overturn a veto. Say a bill isn't vetoed or is vetoed and is the council overturns that veto, the bill has effectively made it through DC's legislature, and then this point, if DC were a state, this would be when a bill would become law after a certain period of after the review periods are over and it passes. However, because we're not a state, the bill goes on to Congress, both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and also to the President of the Senate. So after 30 days of the review period for Congress, if there is no action on the bill is then passively passed into law. However, Congress can and has, as they've done with our criminal code bill, they can reject the bill and basically nullify it. The president has the ability to overturn that, and it's a whole process. But essentially, what makes this process very unique is that once the voters of DC have decided on their elected officials, and the elected officials have then passed a bill that should come into law, unfortunately, it becomes then it could become a political football past that point once it reaches Congress. Usually, it is passively approved, but we are skeptical and wary that there could be more meddling with DC's own governance and self-autonomy. So that's the bill process. A ballot initiative, in my opinion, is also a very fun process for me, because it's like the people are kind of like saying, okay, we want to organize and put something on the ballot for the people to decide on and make into a law. So the ballot initiative process is the supporters will file a measure with the Board of Elections, and then the Board of Elections will consider it if it's proper subject matter or not. There's a hearing, and then 20 days after the Board of Elections accepts as a measure, it must prepare an official summary statement. And once that happens, a challenge period begins where honestly, anyone could challenge a ballot initiative. And if that happens, there is a legislative process that goes back and forth. Sometimes something has to be refiled a few times to be able to move past that challenge period. At the end of the challenge period, if the petition is approved, then it moves to adopt a public meeting. That means that we are able to then support the circulation of the petition to get that ballot initiative onto the ballot. So you have about 180 days to gather signatures, and it has to be reflective of at least 5 of the 8 wards. And I think it actually has to reflect at least 5% of the registered voters in 5 of the 8 wards to be able to make it onto the ballot. Once something makes it onto the ballot, then it's certified. The signatures of the voters from the petition gatherers, the Board of Elections will then go through a period of certifying those signatures. And if all of the signatures and they have a little cushion to they're verified, we are able to then move that ballot initiative onto the ballot, where then the voters of DC will be able to if it's either in the primaries or in the general, be able to vote on that ballot initiative. If it passes, say the ballot initiative gets a majority of the votes, then that effectively goes into law. The only way that, and this has happened also in the past with Initiative 77, which was repealed, and there was a repeal to the repeal, which is the One Fair Wage initiative to establish a minimum wage for tipped workers. The council could indeed create a bill that could overturn or repeal a ballot initiative. then there would be a referendum process that could repeal that repeal. And this is getting into the minutiae and the weeds, so let me know if I should step back a little bit. But then once that process happens, it goes on to, again, unique to DC, to have passive approval through Congress.
Wow. Bree, I cannot imagine a more perfect panelist than you to walk us through how policy is constructed and overridden. I say that very deliberately in DC. Thank you for this wealth of information. And folks, if you have questions for Bree or for Jade or Layla or myself or any of us, please put them in the questions tab and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. Thank you so much, Bree. I'm going to keep us moving and then we'll come back to questions in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so just a reminder to please plug into Repro Action campaigns. Join us, sign up for our alerts at reproaction.org. You can follow us on social media. We are Repro Action on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar, which will take place on Wednesday, June 28th at noon Eastern. Gun control now. That is a reproductive justice issue, and we are really excited to discuss it with you. So I'm going to move now to Q&A. And I want to first throw out an observation that was given by someone watching who said that, should also mention that if DC were a state, or if DC has got the statehood it deserves, there would be 2 additional senators and 1 additional voting House member who would, the person said, presumably support abortion and reproductive rights for everyone. And it is, and I just want to really thank the person for bringing that up, because the fact of the matter is, by being denied those folks in both the Senate and the House, we do have Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is in the House of Representatives, but is a non-voting delegate. I mean, how insulting is that, that she's not able to vote? That, DC statehood is absolutely being blocked by people who are nervous about the fact that DC's population tends to be pretty progressive and are extremely likely to elect people like that. It brings me to a question that I'd like both of our panelists to take. Maybe we'll start with Jade and then go to Bree. And I just want to reflect a bit on a personal experience that I had. So I very much remember being pregnant with my daughter, living in DC, and then Congress starts anti-abortion politicians in Congress start trying to advance toward putting in place an abortion ban specific to DC. And I think what a lot of people don't understand who don't live in DC is that the radical right often uses DC as its grounds for social experiment. So it was very poignant to me that here I am pregnant with my daughter, literally testifying before the DC Council about this abortion ban that the feds wanted to do, and to my local representatives, and still the power was held somewhere else. So my question, let's start with Jade and then go to Bree. For people who don't live in DC, why should they care about the fact that DC statehood, that DC doesn't have its statehood?
This is a big question, Erin. Wow. I think my first instinct is that, especially, I don't know, as people on the left flank of politics, as leftists, as progressives, as people who are part of this movement, ever since, I would say, in the abortion part of the movement, since Dobbs, I think we really have had an understanding that when access is taken from one of us, it really is taken from all of us. And we do live in an ecosystem of abortion access and of care. And for example, in the past week, we've significantly lost access in South Carolina. There's going to be an outlawed abortion ban, and in North Carolina, there's been so many new restrictions introduced when it used to be legal up to 3 weeks, and that has deeply affected DC. We already had so many people coming from North Carolina here. That's our top out of region state from which we serve callers and have people traveling here. So that is going to deeply impact DC. So I'm going to flip it to the other side of saying, okay, when we know that we live in this landscape of care, when we know that the abortion access infrastructure across the country is extremely fragile, then if it is threatened somewhere, we know it's a threat everywhere. So I would first ask folks who are in solidarity with the movement for reproductive justice, the movement for abortion access, and I would say, considering that we're an abortion fund and we do a lot of economic justice work, I'd also shout out, the labor movement, especially right now, which is having so much action, to see that, okay, when they come for DC, they do come for all of us. There's just so many examples in the way that right now they're fighting with us about our police reform bill. In the past, they blocked the ability for undocumented folks here to vote, which the DC Council did want. Just in all of these movements for a progressive, better world, DC really is and has become a battleground because of these extremist members of Congress who I totally agree with you, Erin, that they see DC as a testing ground, and I would take that even further and say they see it as, a lot of them, like a playground for white supremacy. They want more cops in our city, and I'll point out that I think it's 80% of cops in DC are not from the city, are from outside. Or there are, I don't know, there's so many hot button issues and fights happening in DC, and it sets an example for the rest of the country because we are the nation's capital. So I'd really encourage folks even outside the city to really pay attention, because also we're an abortion destination, and as all-out bans become the norm, especially in the South, even though our funds, our sibling funds and the clinics are still fighting, they have to rely on us in DC and folks in Virginia more and more and more. So we need abortion access to be safe here. We need our community to be supported. We deserve to be able to thrive and have our full civil rights. So I'd encourage everyone to really pay attention to DC Statehood and support the #HandsOffDC coalition, which we're a part of, and which is led by Harriet's Wildest Dreams and DC Vote and DC for Democracy and DC Justice Lab and a few other awesome organizations which are on the side of abolition, justice, and liberation.
I also want to add, so well said, Jade. I want to add that, yeah, we're a sanctuary city, and people should care who aren't in DC, because DC will be a safe place to get the care you need. And as you said earlier, I believe it might have been actually Erin, that, yeah, we'll get 2 senators with statehood, and they could effectively protect not only DC rights to bodily autonomy, but also help with the national effort to protect rights to bodily autonomy, which would explain why there is fear and cowardice to suppress DC statehood. I also want to boost the Hands Off DC has been awesome at doing direct action to say, hey, we deserve to have right and self-governance over our own state, and take your hands off trying to make this a political playground where you can show that you are quote unquote tough on crime and create a theater out of DC when it's real lives you're playing with.
Thank you so much for that. So the next question came in that says, there are some cities that have citywide abortion funds for local folks and people who come to DC for abortion care. Would DC have a shot at establishing a similar fund regardless of statehood? Jade.
So what this person is describing is exactly what the DC Abortion Fund does. We're just not a member of the city. We're not part of city government. We're an external organization, but we fund anyone living in or traveling to the Washington, D.C. area. So we have that power. For developing that on a city level or a more state government level, I think that would be probably a question for the DC government. But as we've discussed, there are a lot of reasons why they're barred from using those federal funds. The DC government is extremely supportive of the DC Abortion Fund, and we definitely have a lot of allies there. But I think the purpose that you're describing is actually exactly what we do. So if you ever need abortion funding, you can call 202-454-7464 or visit our website, and yeah, we'll fund your abortion.
Great. And the original questioner came in with a clarification. They're talking about a city council administered fund that works in tandem with the DC Abortion Fund. Examples include, I know this happens in New York City. The person is saying that Austin had one at one point in time. So I think what the person is talking about is there a possibility without statehood for the DC Council and the DC Abortion Fund to buddy up and get more public funds into the abortion fund model?
So I think at our current place, which like we mentioned, there is Hyde and specifically there is Dornan, and there is this congressional oversight. So I would say without statehood, I don't see that as a possibility. However, if we continue to fight for statehood and fight the Dornan Amendment, which again is the amendment that specifically bars DC from using Medicaid funds or federal funds for abortion care. After that, then we can have that conversation. But unfortunately, where we are now, we need statehood in order to do the awesome and progressive and proactive legislation that other cities get to do, because their state treats them like a state. They have autonomy, they have sovereignty, and our home rule just isn't respected in the way that other cities get to do because they're a part of actually a state.
Thank you. And I just want to appreciate Jade, I believe it was you who earlier mentioned the issue of white supremacy, and just to underscore that DC's lack of statehood is absolutely tied in with the fact that DC has such a large, well, it's no longer majority Black population. It is a very large population still. And this is absolutely rooted in racism and not providing equal representation for all people in this country. We are coming up at time. I want to thank both Bree and Jade for sharing your expertise. I want to heap gobs of praise and appreciation to Layla Salam, our organizer, based right here in DC, doing fabulous organizing work on abortion and reproductive justice, and making these and drawing these connections with DC statehood and bringing everyone here together today. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next month to talk about guns and gun control. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.